Hi, everybody. Is this working all right? So I'm not a performer, but like performers, when I'm on stage, I could briefly take this off. Welcome to our lecture today. This is part of our year-long celebration of UCM's sesquicentennial. Dr. Dan Cruz is presenting the life and legacy of Dr. Charles R. Mays. I want to thank you all for joining us, including those of you, as I understand it, are joining virtually. Dr. Cruz is a longtime community member here at UCM, having come to the university around the time I was in high school. He's a prolific scholar of early modern European and English history, is very active in the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies. He is a widely recognized expert on the 16th century Spanish religious and political writer. There was not a big difference between those two things back then in Europe. Juan de Valdez. Today, Dr. Cruz will be telling us about one of UCM's own alumni, Dr. Charles Mays, whose legacy continues to this day, nearly 70 years after he graduated. So I present to you Dr. Dan Cruz, and I believe he is going to present to you some special guests we have today.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean Sawyer. Since I'm more than 10 feet away, I don't have to wear a mask. We have with us Richard Adams, nephew of Charles Mays, his wife, Julia. Richard's the son of Charles's only sibling, sister, Mary Catherine. She went by Mary Kay. And then Bob Prince, who's a cousin from his father's oldest sister, Eula Gertrude. Glad to have them here. It's been an honor to do this research. And I'll just get going with the show. The title's Town and Gown, The Life and Legacy of Dr. Charles R. Mays. About 10 years ago, the UCM Foundation notified the history program that Dr. Charles Ray Mays, retired professor of history, left a $200,000 endowment to fund scholarships for UCM history majors. Immediately, we wondered who was Charles Mays and why would he leave such a large endowment for our history majors? We had no clue about the vital role the Mays family played in the building of Warrensburg and its university, nor could we have imagined how much his upbringing and education here shaped his character and academic career. Before I begin, I want to thank Dr. Mays' nephew, Richard Adams, and his wife, Julia, for sending me abundant materials Dr. Mays had meticulously organized about himself and his family. I also thank the Johnson County Historical Society, Dr. Amber Clifford and Ashley McGuffey of the UCM McClure Archives, and the Office of Deeds and Properties in the Warrensburg Courthouse. After reflecting upon these materials, I believe a better title for this presentation would be How Charles Mays Dropped into History. In April 1945, Charles, or Charlie to his close friends, served as navigator and bombardier in a B-24 Liberator striking the Brenner Pass. After losing 3 engines, the crew had to parachute behind German lines. After I'd left the burning plane at an altitude of 18,500 feet, a foolish thought flashed through my buzzing head. Since I felt no downward motion whatsoever and seemed so utterly suspended up there, it occurred to me that my parachute might be supersaturated with air and that perhaps I should never reach the ground, but forever float in the netherworld between heaven and earth. Soon my brain began to function more rationally, and I discarded this theory as being totally unscientific and certainly no credit to my years in college. We'll leave Charles hanging as he reflected upon his education at Central Missouri State Teachers College, class of 1942. Oh, this got changed. It's not working. The first slide. Yeah, that's Charles on his graduation day in 1942. Looks pretty happy. Is it work now?
Let's try it again.
No, I don't think I'm working.
One more time.
Do I need to come up there and flip it?
We'll get you a different one. One more time.
Sorry. Well, I'll keep going. Actually, Charles dropped into Warrensburg history at birth, as evidenced by the earliest histories of Johnson County, Missouri. Before there was a university or even a Warrensburg, John Mays established his farm just outside today's Warrensburg city limit off Highway 50 on Northeast 501st Road. There, John fenced in a cemetery that yet remains. In 1881, the Kansas City Historical Society published the first history of Johnson County, and it included quotes from J.B. Mays, John's eldest son, who was 13 when the family settled here in 1835. It took 6 pair of oxen to break the prairie land. Now 2 horses can do the work. J.B. went on to describe wild game and the passage of Kansas hunting parties through the area. In addition to farming, John Mays built the first wool carding machine in Warrensburg and operated the first hotel. The 1881 history particularly praises the 60-year-old J.B. Mays. In any place, in any country, his commanding presence and polite demeanor would be admired, but when to these traits are added the undeviating honesty, unlimited generosity, and numberless intellectual excellences, he becomes worthy of special mention. Usually referred to as Judge Mays, J.B. had 11 years of paid education and served as a justice of the peace from 1850 until the start of the Civil War in 1861. In 1915, Judge Mays' eldest son, William J. Mays, then mayor of Warrensburg, went to Columbus, Missouri, and recalled that he had not visited Columbus in 52 years when he was a boy. Thank you. That year was 1863, and William Clark Quantrill had encamped his Confederate guerrillas near Columbus. In August 1863, Quantrill's gang burned Lawrence, Kansas, and slaughtered 160 to 190 civilians. When Judge Mays heard his son talk about possibly joining this bloody band, he quickly moved to Illinois. Mayor Mays says that trip to Columbus 52 years ago evidently caused him to be a citizen of Illinois for a time. In 1872, Judge Mays was elected supervisor of the Warrensburg Township, making him an ex officio county judge. Afterwards, he was twice reappointed county judge by 2 successive Missouri governors. The first, a former Confederate officer, and the second, a former Union officer. Few of his decisions have ever been taken to appellate court, and in those few, most verdicts were upheld. However, Judge Mays made some political enemies for 2 primary reasons. He was a temperance man who refused to grant dram shop licenses for the sale of alcohol. And he staunchly defended the bond issues for the new university, Normal School Number 2. To do this at that time made him very unpopular with certain elements in the county. Judge Mays died in 1905, leaving behind 8 children, the oldest being Charles Mays' grandfather, William J. Mays. In 1918, Ewing Cockrell published the second history of Johnson County. Cockrell knew the Mays family well, especially the well-known and highly respectable William J. Mays. After the Civil War, W.J. decided to explore the cowboy life in Texas and New Mexico before returning to Warrensburg in 1872. The same year, he married Josie Lee, daughter of a prominent physician. William J. soon became a large-scale cattleman owning a 1,500-acre ranch in Montserrat. The Pacific Railway had reached Warrensburg in 1864, just in time for the boom in the beef industry after the war. W.J. diversified his assets and became one of the leading businessmen in the county. He helped organize the Commercial Bank of Warrensburg, which he directed, served as president of the Home Telephone Company, and was president of the Knob-Noster Brick and Tile Company. The Knob-Noster Brick Company was one of the largest and most automated in Missouri, producing over 30,000 bricks a day. Because of the Pacific Railroad, the urban center of Warrensburg shifted east from the old courthouse to the new courthouse where Old Drum stands guard. The new commercial development would most likely have been built using bricks from the Knob-Noster Brick Company. William J. Mays was elected mayor of Warrensburg in 1913, 1915, and 1917, and built a nice home just east of Pirtle Springs on land from the original Mays farm. The top left is a picture of W.J. Mays, and that was in Cockrell's history book, History of Johnson County. To the right is a picture of the Knob-Noster Brick Company, and bottom left is a picture of Mays at his home in the 19-teens. And actually, Ray, his son, and Chloe, Charles's father, are in that picture as well. Farmers across the country had to deal with a double disaster after World War I: the Spanish flu epidemic and the collapse of agricultural commodity prices. On the 7th of February, 1922, the Knob-Noster Brick Company fell to the auctioneer's gavel. The very next day, Charles Ray Mays was born. W.J. died of apoplexy, or a stroke, 10 months later, leaving behind 4 boys and 2 daughters. The oldest, Eula Gertrude, moved to Sedalia to teach at the Central Business College, and there met and married Professor M.G. Lyons in 1901. The couple eventually moved to Alabama, and her grandson, Bob Prince, is here this afternoon. William Ray, he went by Ray, Charles's father, and Uncle Jesse, a Marine and World War I combat veteran, were the youngest children. A member of the Mays family must have resided on the original farm in 1976, as it made the list of bicentennial farms still in the family of the original settlers or homesteaders. Charles's father, Ray Mays, was born in 1882 and died in 1958. His obituary lists him as a retired farmer, but in the late teens and early 20s, he was the proprietor of the Southern Highway Garage and sold Oakland automobiles, later renamed Pontiac by General Motors. He married Chloe Miller in 1910, and the couple eventually bought a farm in Long Prairie, about where the Johnson County Fairgrounds are located off Highway 50 West. That is where Charles and his sister Mary Catherine spent much of their childhood. After the passing of Ray's mother in 1944, Chloe and Ray moved to a farm on the original Mays land, 1.5 miles south of Warrensburg. So bottom left, you can see Ray at his garage. And if you look to the left in that picture, you see the Oakland automobiles that he sold. Top left is the farm, the Longview Prairie farmhouse, again, where Charles would have spent his high school years earlier. And then to the right is the farmhouse south of Warrensburg that they moved to in the 40s. And then bottom right, I like that picture. There's Charles when he was a freshman in high school with his cow named Tilly. Samuel Washburn Miller had moved to Warrensburg from Allen County, Ohio. Samuel's first wife, Catherine Leedy Miller, had two daughters, Mabel and Chloe. After Catherine's death in 1893, Samuel Miller remarried. Aunt Mabel married Floyd Brown, and together they ran a business college in Colorado Springs, starting in 1916 or 1917. Charles and Chloe remained quite close to Mabel and her family. In fact, they're alive. The Millers lived in a stylish home on the shore of Lake Senna beside the property known as Pearl Springs. Today it is owned by University of Central Missouri and is home to a magnificent golf course. The W.J. Mays farm south of Warrensburg was also near Pearl Springs, as was the Carnegie farm, where the internationally famous author Dale Carnegie spent his late teens. Both Dale and his older brother Clifton attended the Warrensburg Normal School, as did Clifton's future wife, Carrie Fight. After Charles's mother's death in 1949, Charles notified Carrie Carnegie, who responded, "What memories came flooding back from years ago, when all of us were young and together so much? You know, I roomed with your mother and Mabel while attending Warrensburg." And the Carnegie lived so close to Grandma Miller, who was one of the world's nicest ladies. Well, you see pictures of Chloe, the two on the bottom, the left, when she was 18. And then you see their nice home. And then you see Samuel and the Miller clan. Now, next to Samuel is his second wife. Mabel's next to her, and Chloe's next to her. And these other children are by his second wife. Grandma Miller is the one holding the young child. Here's an interesting picture, I guess before Charles was born. There's Mabel on the left. You can barely see Chloe on the right. Ray's in the middle. I believe that would be Mary Kay in front of him, because she was 9 years older than Charles. Dale Carnegie's program in speech and expression required Latin in both his junior and senior years. In 1955, Central Missouri State College granted Dale an honorary degree, and a Newsweek reporter quoted him as saying, "I didn't quite graduate, and I'm glad I've forgotten everything about Latin." Dale left Warrensburg after his junior year to seek his fortune, but apparently carried an old flame for Chloe Miller Mays. In 1932, Dale sent Chloe his book, Lincoln the Unknown, with an inscription on the inside page. "This book is inscribed to Mrs. Chloe Mays, who helped me to study Latin and hired me to pick strawberries when we were kids together in the long ago. I hope, Chloe, that you enjoy the book half as much as I enjoyed knowing you." The reference to Chloe tutoring Dale in Latin appears to be an inside joke and adds weight to Dale's later inference to his flunking Latin. He continued to send Chloe books with inscriptions suggestive of a teenage crush. In 1936, Dale achieved international fame with his publication, How to Win Friends and Influence People. The next year, Dale came to Central Missouri State Teachers College and was photographed with Chloe in front of the administration building. And that's the picture on the right. The following year, the college brought Dale back to celebrate Dale Carnegie Day. In Charles Mays' materials, there's an envelope of newspaper clippings about Dale, but no mention of his knowing the rich and famous author, which he undoubtedly did know him well. In fact, many of those books are sent to Chloe and to Charles. You see on the right picture Dale sent Chloe, in which he inscribed, "Chloe, this is me," or I if you prefer, "and a sheep 2 miles above sea level in the Alps." The sheep is the one on the left. Looks like he could use a shearing job, doesn't it? Charles expressed deep feelings for his mother after her death, referring to summer evenings they spent together when we discussed religion, the mysteries of the universe, politics, books, war, and so many things in which Mother had a vital interest. Charles's paternal grandfather had been a Presbyterian, suggesting that the religion Charles inherited came from his mother. Charles kept his certificate of baptism into the Church of the Brethren, along with a newspaper photo of the pastor who performed the service. The Church of the Brethren are doctrinally primitive Baptists related to Quakers and Mennonites. They stress humility expressed through periodic foot washing ceremonies. In fact, down south, they're called foot washing Baptists. Upon later meetings from Church of the Brethren leaders in the Louvre in Paris, Charles commented, "I had not realized how hungry I was to see the brethren again. For brethren are always unassuming, unpretentious, friendly, a pleasant relief from people one always finds in cities. Pseudo-sophisticates, the blasé, the cynics, the disinterested." In his last will and testament, Charles left $60,000 to the Warrensburg Church of the Brethren. Charles's overseas diary of 1945 and journals from 1948 to 49 and 1951 to 52 reveal regular church attendance, often followed by critique of services of various denominations. He was certainly not a teetotaler, but only mentions over-drinking during World War II. In his later journals, Charles expressed his disgust numerous times with loud, boastful people at cocktail parties. Charles entered Central Missouri State College, Teachers College in 1939 and excelled in European history and French. He graduated in 3 years at the end of the summer 1942 term. The historian Rolla Wood, for whom the Wood Building is named, served as his primary mentor. And top left, that's Rolla Wood teaching in 1941. Despite Charles's heavy class load, he engaged in student government, had membership in the Foreign Language Club and the International Relations Club sponsored by Professor Wood. Charles joined the Phi Sigma Pi fraternity, also led by Professor Wood, and worked in the History Social Studies office. A fellow History Social Studies major commented on Charles's Rhetor, that's our university yearbook, "In the days to come, let us found a memorial for Rolla F. Wood, one of America's truly great leaders." Charles dropped by the college to visit Professor Wood in the summer of 1949 prior to entering the PhD history program at the University of Minnesota. Charles had an endearing personality as evidenced by numerous comments in his 2 Rhetors. At 6'1" and 145 pounds, Charles cut a tall and lanky figure. And some girls teased him about his 1942 Rhetor photo right behind me. "Hope you don't crack that nut between your teeth. Your picture isn't so good, but you're a swell guy." Some classmates commented on good times had it an unappetizing haunt referenced as the Ptomaine Tavern. Some things never change. Charles was clearly a lot of fun to be around, but several students noted he was also a bit peculiar or even crazy. Perhaps that explains why he ended up in a B-24 heavy bomber. The 15th Army Air Corps in Italy lost over 2,000 liberators between 1943 and 1945. There were 6,000 liberators in Italy at the end of the war. It does not require a math major to calculate the extreme risk of flying in heavy bombers, but that is what Charles decided to do. Uncle Sam came calling before the ink had time to dry on Charles's diploma. He reported as an enlisted man to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in October 1942. Apparently, his freshly minted degree enabled him to apply for officer training school to become a navigator. After gaining commission as a second lieutenant, Charles and the other 8 men in his flight crew trained together and left for Europe along with a brand new Liberator, and there they are. This is the new Liberator. This is before they got to Europe. He has the name of all of his crewmates on the back of this picture, and he visits a bunch of them after the war. They were so proud of the plane. However, after reaching Italy, they were assigned the Blue D, which they dubbed the Blue Dog. It had already flown over 71 missions before Charles and company arrived. Charles and a good friend, Lieutenant Ray 80, hiked up hills near the Adriatic Sea and looked across to view Yugoslavia. Charles said, "For the thrill of it, I'd like to have to bail out, maybe over Yugoslavia, and be picked up by partisans and led to safety. What an adventure that would be." Lieutenant 80 simply responded, "It might happen." He didn't share the joy here. On April 8, 1945, the Blue D and a box squadron of liberators hit the Forteza Railway Bridge in the Brenner Pass. There's a picture of box squadron formations. It was a clear day for bombing and for anti-aircraft artillery. The Germans shot down one B-24 and a flak burst killed the co-pilot in another. That night, Charles wrote, "I pray God for no more missions like that today." God instead decided to grant Charles's wish for an adventure. Charles had to write his diary entries from the 11th of April to the 19th of April from memory. On the 11th, the Blue Dog again went to bomb the Brenner Pass along with 6 other liberators in box formation. Blue D filled the number 7 slot called the Purple Heart spot because it trailed behind. The Old Dog's number 2 engine gave out before reaching the target, making it impossible to reach the bombing altitude of 25,500 feet. The crew pressed on and delivered their bombs, but soon after, the number 4 engine received a direct hit of flak and was out. The number 3 engine then caught fire, which spread to the wing because of a gas leak. Time to hit the silk 30 miles behind German lines just south of Modena, where they make the Ferraris. Pulling out on his parachute's risers, Charles missed a farmhouse and slipped through branches of a pear tree on a steep hillside. He tore ligaments in his leg, causing him to limp for months. About a dozen friendly-looking Italians surrounded him, shouting, "Partigiani, partigiani," that is, anti-fascist partisans. An elderly lady wearing black kissed him on both cheeks. Soon, Carrie Trincani arrived and served as translator. Her parents had immigrated to the United States and returned to Italy when she was 16. There's Charles as a navigator in action. There's Carrie Trincani. The picture is dated 1946 or 1947, and that's before Charles goes back to Europe. So she must have mailed that to him after the war. So that's how she appeared, middle-aged farmer's wife. All 9 crewmen survived, but 2 could not walk and were left behind at a safe house from which they were eventually rescued. Charles's leg hurt so bad that he had to crawl for much of the 4 days of mountain climbing. Guides took the crew to a safe house where a larger group of well-armed partisans took over and led them through the German lines. They passed within 75 feet of a German artillery emplacement. Finally, they reached the town of Braga behind the American line. They were welcomed by an advanced post of the 92nd Infantry, an African-American unit. Rather surprisingly, after the Germans surrendered 3 weeks later, Charles wrote, "I wish I could find a way of staying here longer. I'd like to see more of Italy and any other part of Europe I could get to. I have a feeling that my experience here will change the course of my life." In Charles's materials, there is a list of 9 visits he made to Carrie Trincani and his Italian saviors between 1949 and 1979. The last notice of Carrie is a 1985 letter Carrie's younger cousin sent Charles, asking him to write about his adventure for a family history. Charles had typed 18 single-spaced pages about his experience in the summer of 1945. In the summer of 2001, he revised the story and entitled it Journal of a Bombing Mission, B-24 Blue D, 1945. A younger university colleague and friend of Professor Mays, Dr. Tom Pearson, said Charles never discussed his war experience with him. Charles had earned the Purple Heart, Air Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster, and the European Theater Campaign Ribbon with 4 bronze stars. Before processing out of the Army, Charles received notice, probably from our university, that he could teach high school in either Odessa or Wentworth Military Academy for the 1945-46 school year. He accepted a position at the latter, earning $1,400 a year. And in his diary said, "That's not too bad." Today, that's a salary of $21,000 a year. It's not too good. After classes started, Charles seemed less pleased with the position. Oh, the saluting. More here in one day than a month in the Army. A few days later, he wrote, "1 week is over. It's Saturday now, and thankfully I have a rest. A day of teaching tires me much more than a day in the Army." That's Wentworth Academy behind me, left. Again, he seemed, Charles taught at Wentworth for 2 years, but he had to get back to Europe. The GI Bill helped him fund his graduate work in history at the University of Maryland. That's a college of liberal arts at the University of Maryland, and Charles studied there. Again, he seemed in a hurry to graduate, taking a 12-hour load of graduate courses his first 2 semesters, mostly in medieval, Renaissance, and English history. His MA thesis, the Aborigines Protection Society, explored the successes and failures of an international humanitarian organization based in London. They investigated problems with all natives, Africans, Native Americans, but mainly natives in or near the British colonies. Charles taught at Wentworth for 2 years, but he had to get back to Europe. The GI Bill helped him fund his graduate work. Oh, I've already said that, sorry. Charles's thesis reveals a deep social consciousness about race relations, quite progressive for the time. In Charles's story of his adventure, he commented that most of the Blue D's crew were more or less racist, especially one from St. Louis. Charles had talked to him about how unreasonable and unjust his deep prejudice was, but to no avail. After being welcomed and saved by the African-American 92nd, Charles got his friend to grudgingly change his mind. In May 1949, Charles heard an African-American, Richard Wright, present a paper in Paris entitled "Literature and the American Negro." Charles wrote in his journal, "Would that all Americans could hear Wright, but not only hear him receptively as well." Charles also supported Native American education. According to his colleague, Dr. Pearson, after Charles retired to Colorado Springs in 1985, he tutored young men from a nearby Native reservation, encouraging them to go to college. In his last will and testament, he left $40,000 to the Oglala Lakota College in Kyle, South Dakota. After finishing his MA thesis, Charles joined a group of Maryland University students who went to study at the Sorbonne. Charles resided much of the time and then hung out much of the time at the University City in Paris. You could pronounce it in French, I'm sure, but after finishing his MA thesis, he took courses in medieval and Renaissance history, but enjoyed visiting cathedrals, palaces, and friends more than studying. He attended numerous operas, plays, movies, and dances. Several times he mentions having to get his shoes resoled from his near continuous walking and dancing. At one point in December of 1948, he anxiously wrote, "I hope that I do not ruin my whole academic future by making a fiasco out of this year." Nonetheless, Charles continued a full social and tourist life, visiting England over Christmas break, Italy over Easter break, and making a ski trip to Switzerland where he fell in love with the mountains, well, among other things. Charles wrote numerous letters to his family, especially his mother, who shared them with the ladies at Shepherd's clothing store in Warrensburg. Chloe kept Charles informed about family and local events, news of their church, deaths, weather, flowers, strawberries and cherries blooming, not to mention some town gossip that I won't go into. Chloe became terminally ill in June of 1949 and was taken to St. Luke's. Charles caught a quick flight home before finishing all his final exams, although he completed them later. More importantly, Charles visited his mother in St. Luke's. She murmured, my boy, my boy." I broke down and wept bitter tears. The day his mother passed away, Charles received notice from the University of Minnesota that he had been granted a teaching assistantship to pursue a PhD in history. But Charles's zest for life had diminished with his mother's passing. I hardly realized how much mother's joy over my successes and joys added to my life. Charles transferred his credits from the Sorbonne to the University of Minnesota, where he continued to study medieval, early modern European, and English history. There's a picture of Burton Hall, where the history department was located. And I had to have a picture of Charles dancing because he enjoyed it so much, and this is a student at University of Minnesota. He took classes with Professor John B. Wolfe, a leading authority on Louis XIV in the United States. He also studied Tudor-Stuart history with Professor David Wilson, who technically directed his dissertation. Actually, because of his Fulbright scholarship, Sir John E. Neal, Astor Professor of English History at University College London, directed Charles's archival work in England. Professor Neal was the leading authority on Elizabeth I and would be knighted for his scholarship in 1955 by young Queen Elizabeth II. And by the way, Charles was at her coronation ceremony. Charles's first semester with Professor Neal, after his first semester seminar with Professor Neal, he wrote, "He is one of the most genial and impassioned historians I've ever met." Charles proclaimed the 27th of March, 1952, the Discovery Day. He had hit an archival jackpot in the British Museum for his dissertation. The early Stuarts and the English peerage, 1603 to 1649. His thesis focused on the sale of noble titles. Professor Neal was impressed and had Charles make a presentation to the class. Professor Neal considered my evidence quite important, for which I am quite pleased and greatly relieved. For whatever Neal says, Dr. Wilson will accept. 2 weeks later, he wrote that Professor Wilson sent him another vague letter without addressing questions Charles had posed to him. I am quite sure he hasn't a clue what I'm doing over here, but at least he still remembers my name. Charles's research pertained to a topic just emerging at the time, which is still debated today: the causes of the English Civil War and its relation to the general crisis of the 17th century. To sharpen his economic and social analyses of the sale of peerages, Charles attended numerous presentations by the influential socialist historian R.H. Tawney at the London School of Economics. Charles continued to maintain his Missouri connection through letters to his father and sister, Mary Catherine, he just called her Mary Kay, who had married Hartley Adams. They owned and operated ABC Cleaners in Kansas City, which Charles sometimes ran when Mary Kay and Hartley went on summer vacation. After her husband's passing, Mary Kay moved to New Jersey in the 1970s to be close to her brother. Charles and Mary Kay planned to move to Colorado Springs together after his retirement, but unfortunately, Mary Kay passed away a few months earlier. So there's a picture of Charles, Mary Kay, and Chloe and Ray. That's 1945, after he returned from overseas. There's Mary Kay and Hartley, and then there's Mary Kay at ABC Cleaners. Charles applied for university teaching positions in the spring of 1952 and landed appointment as an instructor of history at the University of Kentucky for the 1952-53 academic year. The next year, he obtained a tenure-track position at Ohio University, today a doctoral granting institution. He finished his dissertation in 1955 and published 2 articles in the very best historical journals in his field: the Journal of Modern History in 1957 and the English Historical Review in 1958. That same year, Charles's father passed away. And there's Charles teaching at Ohio University, and there he is leaving his office. He looks kind of happy. 1964, Dr. Mays accepted appointment as chair of the Department of History and Government at Monmouth College in New Jersey. The lure of being near New York must have been attractive, particularly after his father's passing. In Dr. Mays's materials are many programs for plays and operas which he attended in New York as well as in Europe. New York was an ideal location for flight departure to Europe, and Charles regularly took groups of students and adults there. Here's just two pictures. Interesting. Two groups of adults, but the pictures in front, both pictures are in front of Heidelberg Castle. I guess he just liked taking pictures there. Well, in a letter he wrote to a former colleague in 2008, Charles noted his health would prevent further travels, but added that he had been to Europe 6 times and to China and Thailand since his retirement in 1985. As a teacher, colleagues mentioned his rigor and ability to attract the best students to become history majors. As chair, he demanded that faculty appear at the university every day, no special schedules, and he did not grant release time. When I mentioned to Dr. Pearson that I was not getting release time for this, he laughingly said, "Charlie would really like that. He was cheap." Dr. Mays built up the reputation of the department, and in 1974, they began offering an MA degree in history. At the time, Charles's dean noted that the Department of History and Government was among the college's strongest academic areas. Unfortunately, Monmouth College experienced a massive enrollment decline caused by the end of the Vietnam draft and the opening of a junior college nearby. Dr. Mays had to let some faculty go, including his good friend, Tony Snyder, who is still alive. Soon after, Tony earned a Fulbright scholarship to research in India, and when he returned, Professor Mays asked him to present his findings to the Janus Society, a group of Monmouth students and faculty who gathered at Professor Mays's home to hear scholarly presentations. And to the right there, that's Charles at home in 1978. Later, Tony regularly visited Dr. Mays in Colorado Springs, and together they toured through Western national parks and collected Native American art. Fallout over the enrollment crisis led to Charles's resignation as chair in 1976. That Charles maintained a long friendship with someone he had to let go speaks volumes about his ability to maintain long-term relationships. Think of Carrie Trincani, Cousin Bob, and a host of friends and relatives not mentioned in this presentation. If he was your friend, he was a friend for life. Dr. Mays belonged to several organizations typical of professional historians. Most impressive was his service as an international counselor for the History Honor Society, Phi Alpha Theta. I suspect he was also extremely proud to be a card-carrying member of the Caterpillar Club, an organization restricted to individuals who parachuted from downed planes and survived. That takes us back to the pear tree, where a gimpy-legged young Charles tried to communicate with friendly and thankful Italians whose language he could not understand. It was probably the happiest moment in his extraordinary life. In the final draft of his adventure, he wrote, "I had not expected such a reception, and for a foolish moment felt almost heroic." Dr. Mays' story of the adventure is without doubt a heroic tale of survival and reflects well on all who had a part in it, even his hometown and alma mater. To conclude, why did Dr. Mays leave a third of his estate to UCM history majors? He knew how important his family had been to the building of both the town of Warrensburg and its university. He also knew his love of Europe began long ago in history classes taught here. Dr. Mays' endowment is by far the largest in the history of UCM's history program. He could have rightfully asked the university to make a big deal about it, perhaps having his name embossed somewhere on campus. No, that would have violated Charlie's upbringing in this town. Thank you. We have time, a few minutes for questions. I know a lot more about this guy. The hardest thing was trying to get down to 40 minutes. Yes?
So Dan, how long did you spend with the 92nd? Did you just pass through, or was it a couple?
It was only a couple of days before they took them back, but they were the ones that, they were on the front line. So yeah, they quickly processed them. And he said the pilot, he didn't like the pilot. They were both second lieutenants and they didn't get along. And he pretty much blames him for not, well, getting them back before they had to parachute out. Yeah, they weren't there. And the pilot did most of the debriefing. Charles said, you know, they just let him do all the talking. He's kind of a macho guy, but anyway. Other questions? Well, his favorite, he had a lot of dates and dancing partners, but the one he mentions the most was the granddaughter of Haile Selassie. She was at Oxford, and some of the Fulbrighters, anyway, they went and picked her up and they had a meal and then they went dancing. Now, he mentions dancing a lot, but he said, I danced with a princess, Sella was her name. And he mentioned every single dance he danced. That is the Charleston, the whatever. I mean, he mentions like 5 different dances. I thought that's pretty cool. He thought it was pretty cool too. Other questions? Yes? Now, I mean, the only journals I have, he kept them when he was in Europe. And then he kind of, how to say this, he kind of didn't like coming back to the United States. He liked European culture. And he didn't like, it's odd that he lived in New Jersey and was near New York, but he kind of cut down New York in his journals when he comes back. He didn't like thought Americans were greedier than Europeans. Well, how many volumes? It's in here. I mean, he wrote a lot. I think about 6 volumes, 51 to 52, but they're little thin journals. And then he wrote the 1945, which is actually in a loose paper, and it's every day. I mean, he tries to record every day unless nothing happens. He's mostly interested in logging what he's seen that day. He just loved everything in Europe. And he took pictures of most everything in Europe. But he has a lot of pictures, you know, from the family as well. He took a lot of pictures. And some of those Miller pictures date back to, you know, really the beginning of the camera. They got pictures of some lady who was born in the 18th century, but it was after a photograph. So it's an amazing photograph collection.
Well, because of him is why I love architecture. And we too were lucky enough to live in Europe for 13 years. So we got to see a lot of the places that I grew up watching slides of when you would come. Very educational. And I don't think you realize the influence he had on architecture. I was a young boy, and I would still remember what cathedral was what. I can go to Europe, live it as well. So,
Yeah, he was a critique. He critiqued these buildings. He would tell you what's good and what's not. And of course, some of them had been bombed. And he would talk about that.
well, we were amazed at how they were rebuilt. And
But you get a lot of information about post-war Europe. And stuff that I didn't know, how they didn't like race relations in the United States. I mean, they often questioned him, and he found it difficult to deal with race relations in the United States. And that some of the Europeans were pro-Soviet. I didn't realize. And he didn't like the way the Army behaved after we went back in with NATO. He thought we acted like Romans. He's pretty strong for a veteran. So he's amazing man. Yes.
You've done quite a deep dive into his life. Any perceptions or any takeaways? Really doing this about a person that you never met?
Well, as a historian, I mean, I've done biography before, and you can fall into the material, and the material was sent to me. I mean, this was, and I found it a lot more interesting than. See, I couldn't go back to Spain because of COVID, and I was working on syphilis in Spain, and this was a little more fun.
You should have been in my hands, with Spain, and I found this whole library, I'm just sitting there and amazed with what I'm finding. Back down and present it. Find all this.
Seems to have been a kind of a direct, military, organized, self-disciplined person. But on the other hand, somewhat, again, this care about natives and his views on race relations, I really find interesting given that time. But it was the time of voter marches after World War II. But
Yeah, and it was very, I'm sure it was hard for him. Mother was, taught me, I guess he's probably the one that taught me.
yeah, well, it shows. I mean, it shows he had, and was it somehow the influence of the Civil War on his family? I don't know, but to have that attitude in '49, not just for African Americans, Native Americans. Yes.
Yes. I was married to Archie Scott Mays.
Okay,
This Archie,
I've heard the name.
James Mays. James Mays is
What?
with James Mays being uncle to Charles.
Yeah, I think he'd be an uncle, not a cousin.
I have 3 children that are Mays, or 2 children that are Mayses.
Really?
So we got some more relatives.
They pop up
Yeah.
There's not many mazes left in Warrensburg, though.
What is interesting is that my ex-husband, Archie, what we call it Scott Mays, built this, was part of the construction company that built this in 1962.
Huh.
So, Charles would not been here then, but.
Well, they would have worked on the wood building in '62 there.
I wonder if Charles knew that.
Now, was Archie the one that went to Vietnam, was in the Air Force?
I don't know if he went to Vietnam, but yeah, he was in World War II. Mike Mays.
No, I went to Vietnam, so.
Okay.
Archie Scott Mays was the Brigadier General.
There's material on him in the Johnson County Historical Society. Yeah, there's a separate folder on him.
His dad, the Mays farm,
Right.
between here and Montserrat, was part of the Mays. I have friends that
Ah,
Okay. Been there?
Yes. So I know the people. so,
You know people.
And
I think you need to know people.
Private property. so you
We
have
heard
to
of
go
a
back.
young man, Charles, was dragged out there to Warrensburg. Whack and kick our way through the
Yeah.
weeds and we never could find the brick factory
It's
either.
got a, cemetery has a fence around.
Now,
Yeah, I think it has for a long time.
oh, he would be so glad that this was
I can put you in contact.
Burton's still on that property. Burton family.
But, I mean, they're newly owned, they're not, history.
Dad and mom was very good. Could ask me that this morning. Yeah. Very there and not the other places. Because we have the Adams Cemetery.
Carlos remained very about his childhood, his whole life. When he moved to Colorado Springs in the early, once a year probably.
yeah, that's something I didn't have time to mention. He had 5 exchange students, one of whom I guess moved in for a long period of time with him.
Yeah, we,
Uh,
I think Joe's probably.
He became really enmeshed in
Really not a bragger.
no.
I mean, you think he was, but he wasn't. There's a lot that we find out later.
Yeah, he never married, and you mentioned he was engaged 2 or 3 times. And I saw one that he was really in love with and got crushed because he was overdoing research. But he had these long-term relationships that made up for the lack of a wife.
Mabel Brown University in Colorado Springs, we lived with her, and then I went out there to take care of her before she passed away. That's how I got interested in Colorado Springs. So I actually lived there before he had. And loved it even more.
I assume he was moving back to be close to the Brown family.
But they
Mabel.
all passed away just before he got there.
Is that right?
yeah, no, he
We had a Florence Brown, one of the wives, Bill Brown, with the Independence.
he just had gone out there as a young, fascinated with like the mountain. Just that was the first time he'd ever seen.
Yeah, when he went to the Alps, he writes in his journal, he had so much fun, a lot of fun. He said he wanted to be a mountain man. That he thought about giving up his whole academic career just to hang out with the skiers and stuff. Anyway. Welcome. Yeah, if we don't break the camera, I don't break the camera.